Well, you think I should just
I think we can go and get started. Yeah, hello, join us. Let's go and get a comfy and we'll see you in the last cushions.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming out. I know that this is only off schedule because of the weather, but appreciate the effort. So this is some research that I've been talking about with students for quite a while. And I guess I should start by acknowledging the students. I'm actually an archaeologist, and I never did this kind of thing until pretty recently, but I got involved with environmental studies a few years ago and working with students and started seeing the kinds of things students were interested in. I think one of the compelling things about this is it's local. You know, it's important to, I think, oftentimes when we're teaching to try and bring this home to people. But so first of all, just to clarify a little bit what we're talking about here. Okay. So LULUs and NIMBY, these are terms that are actually used in the environmental justice literature quite a bit nowadays, but just want to clarify them. They don't mean exactly the same thing, but they're obviously kind of closely related. A locally unwanted land use is the kind of thing that I don't want in my backyard. But these, these are things that we all are concerned about. We all want these kinds of things. We all, want highways and railroads and stuff like that. We all want mines because we need minerals. We all want the kinds of products that produce toxic waste and that kind of stuff. So we all want this stuff. We all benefit from it, but it's just a matter of who pays for it eventually. So I'm gonna first just kind of set the stage here. I'm sure everybody's familiar with Little Rock Central High School. And what happened there in 1957, basically they had to call out the National Guard to protect these, the Little Rock Nine, these 9 students, 9 teenagers who basically just wanted to go to high school. And, this sort of was an early, I think, seminal moment in the civil rights movement, which ultimately culminated in the Civil Rights Act there. And there's Lyndon Johnson with Martin Luther King Jr. handing him a pen that he signed the Civil Rights Act with. Now, I was 4 years old when this happened, so I don't remember it or anything, but I did grow up in a time when, thought that we were solving these problems. I thought that we lived in a country where, these kinds of problems, we were making progress. And, I grew up, maybe like many people, kind of naive in that way, because I was a little white boy in the suburbs and didn't really know what was going on in the world. Turns out that we haven't solved these problems. This is just some numbers from Arkansas in 2019. It turns out that African-American and Hispanic people have higher levels of poverty, lower household income, higher relative housing costs. Whatever we are here, 62 years later or something, we've solved some of the problems. We actually, have made it legal for people of color to go to our public schools and things like that, but we still haven't addressed some of the deep underlying problems. So that's kind of what I want to get at a little bit here. How is it that, after all this time, we still haven't made any progress? And being an archaeologist and being someone who's interested in landscapes and long-term history and that sort of thing, start off with a little terrain and kind of thinking about Arkansas. One of the things we notice is that all the water in Arkansas, pretty much no matter where water falls in Arkansas, it flows from northwest toward the southeast. And even in this terrain map, you can kind of see the flatlands over there, the Mississippi Delta floodplain area. You've got the coastal plain down here, and then the Ouachita and Ozark Mountains. And that's reflected in these physiographic provinces. Basically, you've got mountains in the northwest bisected by the Arkansas River, and then lower lying land to the southeast. And these differences corresponded to Native people before white people ever got here. And there are lots and lots of Native people have lived here over the years, over the thousands of years, really. But these are the main tribes that were here when Euro-Americans arrived in the area and started influencing land use and that sort of thing. And their territories correspond fairly closely with those physiographic provinces we were just talking about. The Quapaw down in the Mississippi floodplain, the Osage up in the Ozarks and Ouachita Mountains, and the Caddo down in that coastal plain. So early on, when the first European settlers came to this part of the world, Rivers were the way you got around, of course. Much of Arkansas was, pretty heavily forested. Not, but there were actually some prairie areas in Arkansas, which is kind of interesting, but a lot of it was pretty forested and pretty difficult to travel overland. So people moved along the rivers. So it makes total sense that little red triangle is where the first settlement, the first European settlement was established in this area, the Arkansas Post. And you can see the territories have changed a little bit. By the time that Native Americans ceded their land to the US government, the territories had changed a little bit. But this is the Quapaw area here. And their lands had been reduced quite a bit. But the trouble with that area where the Arkansas Post was, this is an illustration of that in 1689. And you can see it's right down there by the river for good reason. But as we can see, looking at it today from the air, it's surrounded by water and it was frequently flooded. There were numerous pretty devastating floods over the years through this area. Early on, there was a very small population and maybe it didn't have quite as big of an impact. But as this became a more important place and it suffered some pretty damaging floods, people decided that that wasn't a good place to have their settlement. So they moved it up. They had to kind of skip over the Quapaw territory and move it up to more central Arkansas, to the location of current Little Rock. And if you look at a topography map, it's pretty clear why they did that. This is where it originally was, down in the lowlands here, and these are this reddish area. These are the hills, these sort of the Ouachita's down here and the Ozarks up there. And they basically came up the river as far as they needed to go to get to some place that would get them up out of that floodplain and protect them from floodwaters in the Arkansas River. And that's the first place that they could kind of get up high enough was Little Rock. There actually is a Little Rock down there. From what I understand, this is down by the river market downtown there. From what I understand, Little Rock used to be significantly bigger than this. I think most of it was quarried a long time ago for stone, but it's still down there if you're interested. So I want to kind of take a second here and just look at the natural terrain and hydrology. So hydrology is how water flows across the landscape, and that affects a lot of things. So the blue line up there you can see is the Arkansas River. And everybody knows that Little Rock is next to the Arkansas River. Maybe what somewhat fewer people know is that there's also a fairly significant water body down here called Fush Creek, and that pink area is the flood zone. So the 100-year flood zone, and you can see the flood zone extends up some of these tributaries. But basically, when they came up and established Little Rock right in here in this area, they kind of put it on a little bit of a peninsula between the Arkansas River and Fush Creek. And there's kind of what Fush Creek looks like. You can go down there today. I've been down there. We went, I guess it was last summer with students. Dr. Hatch and I took a couple students down there and we brought kayaks down there and paddled around. Parts of it are still quite lovely. Parts of it, as we'll see, are not quite so lovely. But this is a real important natural resource. Both in terms of flood management and that kind of thing, but also in terms of wildlife. A lot of different species live here. So this is the blue line there, the blue box is the original settlement of Little Rock. And it seems slightly askew. It's because it is slightly askew. When they first laid it out, they just didn't quite have the instruments they needed to make it perfect. But that's the original settlement of Little Rock. And the very first thing that they did when they established the city of Little Rock was to draw what has come to be known as the Quapaw line. And if you go down to that part of the city nowadays, you can still see that down in that riverfront park, there are little markers down there indicating where the Quapaw line was. And the Quapaw line was basically an effort to racially divide this area. So basically the Quapaw Indians were expected to stay to the east of that line, and only white people could be in the Little Rock proper. This didn't last very long. Within a few years, the white settlers in Little Rock realized that that was really good agricultural land to the east of that line. And so within a few years, they chased the Quapaw off of that land too and sent them somewhere else. But this, from the very outset of Little Rock, it has this sort of quality of racial division. The city started to expand. Of course, the city itself can't expand very much to the north because the river's there, although there is, of course, a North Little Rock, and North Little Rock has some of the same kinds of problems. They're just, they play out geographically slightly differently, but they're the same kinds of problems. But generally speaking, Little Rock itself grew to the west and south because that was kind of the way that it was constrained. Along comes the Civil War. Well, I guess I should go back here and just say, when Little Rock was like this before the Civil War, it was actually somewhat integrated because most of the African Americans living in Little Rock were slaves, and they had to be close to, whoever they were working for. So Little Rock was not really that divided in terms of white and African American at this time. But following the Civil War, a lot of freed slaves wanted to move to Little Rock, and the white people in Little Rock, quickly took issue with that and sort of created another line. And this was not quite as rigid a line. The Quapaw line was actually sort of a legal demarcation. If you were Indian, you're not supposed to cross that line. This line is not quite that rigid. The one going across there, that's basically West 9th Street. African Americans could go north of that line, but it was one of those things they probably weren't supposed to be up there, after dark, but they could go up there and work for somebody or something like that. The little black box there is what came to be known as the Black Business District. Black Business District was a thriving enterprise up until the 1960s. So this wasn't really that long ago. There are living people who remember this and who talk about it as being a great place. A lot of successful businesses. Given just an inch of room, these African American entrepreneurs created their own businesses and were successful and profitable, and everything was going just fine, it seemed like. But soon after some of these changes are taking place, and you might have heard of bank redlining. Bank redlining is basically sort of an institutional racism where basically the government sort of conspires with lending institutions to decide who they should lend money to. And redlining basically referred not to my red lines here, but to the lines that they do on maps. I want to take a quick second and comment on my color scheme here. This yellow to blue color scheme is what is called a viridis palette. And the reason I use it is because colorblind people can see it. And I did not know this until fairly recently, but 8% of the population, more than 8% of the population is colorblind, and they can't see those red to green schemes that we always use. So that's why I'm using this scheme. But basically what we see in the bank redlining here, with the way they categorize lands, best, still desirable, definitely declining, and hazardous. Hazardous does not refer to the environment in any way. What they mean by hazardous is it's hazardous to lend money to those people being people of color. And so you can see already, the city is becoming sort of, pretty clearly divided. You've got a couple areas down here by Central High School and the Governor's Mansion that are still, considered desirable. But most of the desirable land where banks would want to lend people money is up in the Northwest. And the areas that are considered hazardous are down here more to the south. So that's already going on by the 1930s. We're already starting to get, some pretty clear divisions, racial divisions in the city. As the city has grown, this is a contemporary satellite photo from Google Earth, but you can kind of see how this plays out. Got the airport, downtown. You can see, this is the Heights and all that kind of stuff. And, lots of people live there. But, if you look at this, you can kind of see all the bright white and everything is kind of down in this area. That's all industry. Those are big buildings with big white roofs on them. Whereas, this stuff up here is more green. There's a golf course up there, a park, people's yards, trees, all that kind of thing. So you can already kind of see some divisions here. This big area right through here is what we were just talking about. That's Fush Creek. So Fush Creek is nice. It's a beautiful place, but you can't live there because it's a floodplain. And so it provides some ecological services, but it doesn't really, it's not a viable place for anyone to live or put a business or anything like that. So we can see what ultimately the result of all of this is that Little Rock is almost perfectly divided into a predominantly white and a predominantly non-white part of the city. I would throw out here just as a little bit of a comment. I'm not completely comfortable identifying people as non-white. It seems to me like maybe that, that doesn't seem quite right to identify people by what they're not necessarily. But unfortunately, that's the way it has basically played out historically, is that, that was the criteria that was used to determine, where you were allowed to live, whether you were allowed to get a loan or things like that, was whether or not you were white. But you can see that, the city has already taken on this very divided character. So mostly white people in the Northwest, mostly non-white people in the South and the Southeast. Pretty early on with the development of the railroad, We see that the railroad was already in the, the lower lying, predominantly non-white areas. By the time we get to the interstate highway system, you remember Dwight Eisenhower started this system back in the 50s. It took several years for it to fully develop, and I guess it's still developing in some ways. But by about 1970, you can see Interstate 630 going across Little Rock. There's downtown. This right here is West 9th Street. And so you can see that, it somewhat corresponds with West 9th Street, but not 100%. It doesn't necessarily have to. No reason why it should. But that's what they did. And, eventually they built the highway, the interstate system. And you're probably familiar with this if you've driven around Little Rock, you've been on these highways. But this is Interstate 630 that I just showed you. You'll notice that 630 goes right smack through the middle of the Black Business District. That was by design. They put it there intentionally to destroy the Black Business District. They could have put that highway, a couple hundred yards one way or the other. They chose not to. They chose to put it right through the Black Business District, destroying it and destroying the businesses and livelihoods of a lot of people along the way, as well as reifying this racial division. So, it's not a perfect line, but it's pretty close to a perfect line. Now you have this giant, concrete and asphalt barrier between the predominantly white and predominantly non-white parts of the city. So, like I said, just reifying that difference. And if we break race down just a little bit more into 4 categories to sort of show where the most white and the most non-white are, we can see that overall the transportation infrastructure is concentrated almost entirely in the non-white parts of the city. So you've got the airport out there, those paint dots. The orange is the railroad. The red is the interstate highway system. You can see that, most of the major transportation infrastructure has been developed in the non-white parts of the city. And that has consequences. I don't have access to good information about emissions or things from the airport or from the railroad, but I did have access to traffic density data for the roads. And you can see that if there's data from the Arkansas GIS office that tells you how many cars per day go down, roads and things like that. And you can see that, it's kind of, traffic density is concentrated in the southern part of the city as well, but it's largely shaped by the interstate. So obviously the interstates where most cars are, but not entirely. Like this is University Avenue there. So it's not entirely driven by the interstates, but mostly it is. And so mostly the traffic is concentrated in the non-white parts of the city. So traffic density, of course, results in pollution. One of the things that we're interested in is PM 2.5. It stands for particulate matter 2.5 microns, which is very, very small particles. So they're so small that they can escape your body's defenses. So the cilia and the mucus in your lungs and things like that can't catch them. So they'll get deep down into your lungs. Those things are, that kind of pollution is a result of traffic. So we can see that, some parts of the city are being, more exposed to that than others. We look further, at other kinds of things. These are the locations of grocery stores. Now, I think the purple ones are like real full-blown grocery stores like Kroger or something like that. The blue ones are kind of more specialty markets. But you can see that, almost all the grocery stores and specialty markets are located in the non-white parts, or in the white parts of the city, predominantly white. And the predominantly non-white parts of the city have very little access to good, healthy grocery stores with things like produce departments and, healthy options for food and that kind of thing. If you add dollar stores, you can see a very different pattern. Dollar stores, we've got Dollar General, Family Dollar, all those kinds of things. These are the kinds of stores that do not have produce sections generally. They have, generally speaking, they sell small quantities of overpriced junk food. So, and you can see, they are very concentrated in the non-white parts of the city. So, we're having very different food choices depending on where you live in the city. Imagine also, access to vehicles. If you don't have a vehicle, which of course is mostly going to be, people lower income, you're really stuck without much easy way to get to a decent grocery store. And this is seen in the U.S. Department of Agriculture Food Access Atlas, where you can see, they have basically characterized these areas according to low income, low access being, again, concentrated in the sort of purple and blue. High income, high access is the yellow and green up there. So we see, kind of no matter how we look at this, no matter what data we're looking at, we see kind of similar patterns. Another thing that we're concerned about is the urban heat island effect. So the urban heat island effect is the effect of lots of concrete and asphalt in these cities, and having so much concrete and asphalt retains heat, especially in hotter months, later into the day, later into the evening. So when it might normally cool off, these areas with lots of concrete and asphalt don't cool off in the evening. They get hotter, and we oftentimes kind of don't think that much about heat as being a real crisis, but heat is extremely dangerous. Heat can kill you today. Unlike some of these other things, which might take years before you get cancer or something, heat can kill you today. It especially affects people who work outdoors. It especially affects people who are low-income people who can't afford air conditioning and stuff like that. So not last August, but the August before that, Dr. Hatch and I and some students went down to Little Rock and worked with them to measure this heat island effect. And, we drove around the city at different times of the day with these little monitors on our cars that measured heat and our location. And then we collected all that data. And I didn't do this part of the analysis. They had another organization doing this, but we just helped them collect data. But you can see that, the heat islands are, again, shaped quite a bit by the interstates, and not just the interstates, but all the commercial development around the interstates. But again, it's concentrated largely in the southern part of the city, with this big exception right here, which again is Fush Creek. So it's nice that they have that nice, cool green area down there in the southern part of the city, except that it's not really accessible to anyone unless you have a kayak. You can't live out there, like I said, or have a business out there or anything. So it's, if you were just measuring the whole southern part of the city, you'd say, well, there's some nice places, but they're nice, but you can't live there. So then let's step back then and look at that hydrology like we were talking about before. How does water flow? And one of the things we notice about this is pretty much like the whole state of Arkansas, everything flows from northwest down to southeast. And we've already seen who lives in the southeast. So when I say everything flows, I mean, if you spray herbicides on your yard, if you wash your car, if you throw trash out your window, whatever it is, it's going to flow from northwest down towards the southeast, towards that Fush Creek floodplain. So the floodplain, like I said, has been identified, ecologically as a very important place. It's important to have a place for floodwaters to go to accumulate until they can kind of, things can kind of settle out and they can make their way out, into the rivers and stuff. So this is an important part of the ecology of Little Rock, an important place to sort of protect Little Rock in a way from floods, is to have some place for that water to go. But if we look at Fush Creek today, it doesn't look like this exactly today, because people have spent a lot of time trying to clean it up. But this is the kind of trash that is accumulating down there, and this is just the visible stuff. This isn't counting all the pathogenic bacteria and all the toxic chemicals and things like that. So Fush Creek has just become a giant, dangerous sort of collection for waste. So the Arkansas Department of Environmental Quality, these are some things off their website. The amount of trash in the creek is astonishing. They did a cleanup. The reason it doesn't look like this anymore is because they did a cleanup. 31.8 tons of trash removed, plus hundreds of tires. They categorize it as a low priority impaired water body because of these pathogenic bacteria. Fecal contamination. There are numerous accounts of manhole covers blowing off the sewer system. When it floods, the manhole covers blow off and raw sewage flows out into that part of the city. So obviously not the kind of thing you want in your streets. Audubon, Arkansas has also done some of their own kind of analyses of this, and on their website, they comment that waste and trash has polluted the landscape. Leachate is, when you think of leachate, think of things that leach down into the soil, toxic chemicals and things like that. Sediment clogs the streams and chokes the vegetation. Aquatic species harmed by pollutants, including oil, chemicals, herbicides, pesticides. So this is a beautiful natural ecosystem that is being destroyed by waste from Little Rock. So I have a couple of questions here that I think are maybe worth discussing. One question that has been in the literature on environmental justice for a long time is race cause or coincidence? So basically the way to think about this is some people have argued that this isn't targeting Black people. This is just there because Black people happen to be poor and we're just putting it in low value land. So that's the way they kind of try to skirt around the issue sometimes. The other question, and maybe the bigger question is, what can we do about it? So to the first question, Reverend Ben Chavis, back in the early 80s, environmental justice wasn't really a thing until the early 80s. Not that people didn't suffer from toxic environments, but it just hadn't become sort of a known field. But Warren County, North Carolina was a location where people, companies from New Jersey and places like that were bringing toxic waste down to dump and trying to find a place to get rid of it. And they were dumping it in Warren County. Now, Warren County is not the only poor county in North Carolina, but it is the county with the highest population of African Americans. The United Church of Christ did this analysis, 1987 Commission for Racial Justice report, and found without a shadow of a doubt conclusively that this is a racial issue. This is not just a poverty issue. If we look at this map that was on the cover of their report, you can see lots of this kind of thing. These are places that are experiencing this kind of problem, concentrated in the South, largely in areas with large African American populations. Over here, you've got populations, Native American populations on reservations. Over here, you've got the Central Valley of California, a lot of agriculture, a lot of undocumented migrants working there and that kind of thing. So, and this has been done over and over again. People have tried to argue about this, over the last 40 years. And, so somebody comes along every now and then and says, no, I found an exception. But, overall, this has been very conclusively established that this is a racial issue. It's not just that they're putting wet toxic waste in low land value areas. They're putting it in places where non-white people live. Robert Bullard started studying this stuff. He was actually a sociology professor somewhere in Houston, and I can't remember that he was at a university there in Houston, but his wife was an attorney and was working for some organization that was actually addressing the fact that they were putting all of their landfills in African-American neighborhoods in Houston. So as a sociologist, he recognized this as an interesting sociological problem and wrote this book, which has since become a classic, Dumping in Dixie, Race, Class, and Environmental Equality, in which he sort of elaborates on this, dumping in Dixie, obviously, sort of concentrated in South, kind of like we were just talking about, but really sort of starts Robert Bullard kind of starts the whole field of environmental justice as an academic field. Now, just as a little bit of an aside, some of you will remember Dr. Chapek. Stella Chapek was here for many years. I think she was here for about 35 years in sociology or something. Something I didn't know for most of the time that I worked with her is she's also kind of a big shot in environmental justice. She was one of the leading people, and she studied environmental justice issues here in Arkansas, Carver Terrace and places like that. So this has become a big field. So lots of people are studying it. And we find, you can do this kind of analysis pretty much anywhere. The specifics are variable. So for example, I grew up in the Denver area. We don't have a large African-American population, or at least didn't at that time in the Denver area, but they put the Interstate I-70 through the Hispanic part of the city. They did the same thing down in Phoenix. If you want to talk to Dr. Goldberg about it, she years ago worked on some analysis in Phoenix showing the same thing. The particular targeted group might vary. Which highway it is might vary, but the thing, this is a common thing in pretty much any major city in America. I taught an environmental justice course last semester, and I've been reading about this for the last few years. So this is just a Google Earth image where I just went and put, the locations where I had read about some of these case studies. And you can see, my interests are sort of in this area. So I read about this area. And then I've traditionally worked out here with Native Americans in the Southwest. So that's why I have, dots kind of concentrated there. But like I said, you've got dots in the Northwest and the Northeast and all over the place. Environmental justice is, a widespread phenomenon, environmental injustice, I should say. So one of the things that you can do about it is, I'm not a policymaker. I'm not a litigator. There are a lot of things I can't do about it, but I am an educator. And so one of the things that we're doing, Dr. Hatch and I are running this LEAP program. LEAP stands for Leadership and Environmental Analysis for the People. And we ran this program last July, and we're going to run it again this July. We had students participate in this, and we teach them about environmental analysis, air and water quality, using geographic information systems to make maps like this. There's Dr. Hatch in the middle with some students installing one of these things. You can see up here, this is a purple air monitor. These are low cost. When I say low cost, they cost about $300, but Dr. Hatch has a machine over there by Mills that costs $600,000. So that's what I mean by low cost. But these things, like the Environmental Protection Agency only has 2 air quality monitors in the entire metropolitan area, one in downtown Little Rock and one in downtown North Little Rock. So they're really not capturing the variability. That's not the EPA's fault. That's just how they're funded. But we're trying to install more of these purple air monitors around campus, or not around campus, but around the city, to get a finer grained sense of where problems are. Here's Dr. Hatch and me with a couple of students. This is that thing we drove around. That little thing up there is the temperature and location monitor, so we could record temperature all over the city. As we drove these pre-planned routes all over the city 3 times during the day, so we could record temperatures. There's our group last year, the LEAP participants. They're all pointing at a little purple air monitor that we had put in down kind of near the junction of 30 and 430. There are some students testing water quality. And there's our whole core cohort from last year. We have just accepted 15 new students for the program this summer, so we're looking forward to doing it again. I think it was a very successful program in the sense that I think students learned a lot. They seem to really be excited about the fact that they could actually do this kind of thing themselves, that they could do that kind of analysis and see for themselves where some of these issues were. But that still kind of leaves the question of, what do we do about it unanswered? I mentioned that I taught an environmental justice class last fall. And one of the things that kind of came out of that class, out of the readings and the discussion that we had about that, was that scientists aren't going to save us. Scientists can do this kind of thing. We can do this kind of thing all day long, but it doesn't really change anything, right? We can provide lots of information and that kind of thing. And so that's what I'm kind of trying to do, is educate people about what's out there. But ultimately, I can't change anything about pollution in Little Rock myself. The government could do it, but the government won't do it unless somebody pressures them. Somebody has to get in their face, and as Martin Luther King said, somebody has to make them uncomfortable. So this is last weekend down in Little Rock at the Hands Off protest. If you managed to get down there for that, I'd say there were probably 300 people there. So not a huge thing. Ours was a little off sync. You might know that there was one the week before that was sort of national. We didn't make that one because of the terrible weather and everything. So we had it last week. But there's another one coming up this weekend, this Saturday, I believe, the 19th, all 50 states. And there are different ones, different organizations organizing different things and stuff. But, this hands-off thing is kind of more about the Trump administration's efforts, with a variety of things. But environmental justice is one of them. One of the things that's being defunded are these kinds of programs to invest or to investigate environmental justice and that sort of thing. So that's kind of where I end up with this. And I guess we have 15 minutes or something. Oh, questions, discussion.
To me, it was just very interesting to see all that in context, because I was born and raised in Little Rock, and I grew up in Little Rock, and I live in one of the areas where like you'll see a Dollar General or like Family Dollar before you'll see a Kroger, and I don't know, I like just being able to see kind of like the history of all this and like what led up to it, and like all the other factors like the heat and the pollution and things like that. Because to me, I knew that like I guess I kind of technically live in like a food desert, I guess, but to see how like that's just like a piece of the puzzle, and there's like all these other things that are like impacting that was just very interesting to me.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I feel the same way, and I think that that's part of my goal here is that a lot of people like yourself, we have many students from Little Rock, and I've talked to other people from Little Rock, non-students from Little Rock. Lots of people have sort of a vague sense that this kind of thing is going on, but may not have really seen it all mapped out, see just how these things are correlated. Like, who would have thought the location of Dollar Generals would be shaped by the way water flowed 200 years ago? But it all fits together. Yeah.
Have you talked to other people that are researching this in other cities?
I haven't talked to too many people about it. That's kind of going to be one of my goals coming up. As some of you may know, I'm retiring in a couple of weeks. And one of my goals in retirement, one of the things I'd like to do, we did tutorials. We developed these GIS tutorials for our students here, but I would like to go down to Little Rock to the high schools and try to see if I can get in there on a Saturday or something with some students and show them how to do this stuff, because we're using all free open source software. It's all free data. So this stuff is accessible if you know how to do it. But that's the trouble. There's lots of data out there that nobody knows quite how to use. So to get to your question, I would like to go on and, I've never really presented this at a conference or anything like that. This isn't my area. Like I said, I'm an archaeologist. So, but I'd like to kind of break into that world a little bit. And one of my next steps is I'd like to go out and develop the same kinds of tutorials in Arizona. The problems are a little bit different, but that's where I have worked and know people, and in particular have contacts with Native Americans. And I think you could do similar kinds of analyses of the locations of copper mines and various kinds of toxic hazards like that. And I would like to go out there and get more involved in that. So the short answer is no, but I hope to.
It's been your experience. I'm asked out of complete ignorance, coming at environmental injustice issues from an archaeologist, as opposed to how a sociologist might approach it, or how an anthropologist might approach it. Is there something you've seen as sort of different ways you either ask questions or things you're interested in and go about it?
Well, there are some things that are kind of unique to my situation. I have always been involved in environmental archaeology. So this, the time periods and the data sets change, but the spatial analysis has always been something that I've done. But like I said, I don't think most people approaching this would go all the way back to the Arkansas Post. Probably that's something that I bring to it, and that sort of big landscape view. I think most people, I've read a few things about this. Most people doing this kind of research, they focus on the city itself, and I think that's something that is just because of my background, I kind of want to see how does the city fit into this larger landscape and into this longer history.
So you said that after they realized that there was good farming land where the Native Americans were, did the city extend in that area, or did?
No, the city has extended just a little bit in that area, but basically they just told the Native Americans they had to leave, and white settlers went down there and established farms and stuff.
Is there an area at all in Arkansas where Native Americans are predominantly?
There are no reservations in Arkansas. There
areas.
Well, I'm sure that there are neighborhoods maybe that have slightly bigger concentration than others, but I'm not really aware of any place that, unlike the Western United States where you have big reservations, most of the Native Americans in the Eastern United States were just removed from their land, plain and simple. So, like I said, we went down to Plum Bayou Mounds a couple of weeks ago. Dr. Shutt and I went down there, and there were about 3 or 4 people who identified as Quapaw Indians there who were participating. It was a public day for visitors at Plum Bayou Mounds, and there were some Native Americans there, but not very many. And I think they kind of know where each other are, maybe, but I don't think they have a place really in Arkansas. Unlike Oklahoma, which is lots of places.
You sort of have the remnants of the Japanese internment camps in the Southeast Delta.
Yeah,
and have larger Asian populations.
Yeah,
and elsewhere. So that's really on that. was curious, this year's cohort, I wasn't clear, is it, Hendrick specific, is it all over the state or?
It is Hendrick specific. We originally wrote a grant proposal to try to make this more broadly available. And we didn't get that grant proposal, but we got Odyssey money. But Odyssey money means we got it at Hendrick students. But I would like to broaden it because I really think that, you know, what I would like to do is to get these kinds of tools into the hands of young people in Little Rock who can use them to fight these battles.
Thinking in terms of original rights, renters, as well, so much of that area, and non-white area of Little Rock, so much rental property as well, and in there you have things in addition to what you showed, cutting down trees in the rental property so that they don't have to maintain the trees or there's no damage to their structures, to the homes and things, which just, you know, that's way the shade and protection for the homes here. And so you may have costs for their utilities, for their air conditioning, producing more conditioning.
Right.
So you're looking at that map, making think that more than just the businesses and the large, you know, structures that contribute, structures that are lower income, also contributing to their choice.
Well, and if you think about those rental properties, you know, another aspect of that is that, you know, they're less likely to be doing, you know, maintenance and upkeep on, you know, fixing lead pipes and stuff like that. You know, you see in the news all the time that, you know, African Americans have higher incidence of asthma, higher incidence of various kinds of cancer and stuff. There's a reason for that, you know.
Do you mind finishing the story of the targeting of the entertainment, the business district, which I guess is also the entertainment district, I know the area.
Yeah, I don't know much more about it. I think there's a couple of historic buildings down there. The with the
Templars.
Templars.
Mhm.
Yeah, Mosaic Templars. I think that caught on fire at one time, not too long ago, didn't it? Yeah. So there are a few relics down there, but as far as all those successful businesses and everything, they just had to move somewhere else. I mean, I don't know a great deal more about the history of it.
But then it wasn't, you were saying intentionally targeted when they could have gone a little north, a little south.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, yeah, if you look at that map, I mean, you can even see that, you know, if they'd just gone straight, would have bypassed that community. You know, they actually had to jog a little bit to the south.
Mhm.
And you know, I don't know, like I said, I grew up in an era when I didn't know about these kinds of things. I'm sure it's because, you know, my environment, my education and stuff, but it kind of blows my mind to think that in our lifetimes, city leaders would decide to destroy a community intentionally based on race.
Well, we can even look, you know, in here at the progress in calling down and all the businesses and homes that are no longer there during my life.
Really?
You know,
Yeah.
So big shiny things.
Yeah.
There's one last remaining black business there. The city is actually currently fighting
Really?
trying to close them down. It's about appearances. It's an auto shop.
Yeah. Is it Matson's? Yeah.
Yeah, they missed a great opportunity to, you know, the art, the MLK art here, which is a really cool, you know, water retention part to reduce the flooding in downtown. And when they were trying to decide how to name the art, there was a big push from so many people in the city to name it after the mess. Not only because of the family that is still there with their business, but also because one of their family members was a Tuskegee Airman. Tuskegee Airman, he was I don't know if he was a PhD, but he taught college somewhere else. But I remember he had a PhD at that time. But instead, they decided that we must have our own military. Actually, maybe there are neighbors throughout the park that you may, recognize some local families and their contributions, but we missed an opportunity at the same time. Slightly taking away the land and tearing down the houses.
I'm not as familiar with the history of Conway. I mean, I've lived here for 20 years. I probably should be more familiar with it, but I would like to do this kind of analysis because I think there's pattern here too that people probably haven't seen illustrated in quite this way. But something that I noticed, and it was only because I was going for a walk that I noticed it. But the Pine Street neighborhood right over there, I noticed that you can't easily walk between Hendricks and the WAC in the Pine Street neighborhood. You can walk between here and there. You can walk north. You can walk any direction except between there and the Pine Street neighborhood, which I don't know whether anybody thought about that or it's intentional or anything, but it is sort of, it's sort of isolating.
Which is kind of strange since the Pine Street community, for many years had a good relationship with Hendricks, at the time, for Dr. Huns and members of the Pine Street community. Leon Walton is a very prominent figure, runs the museum and things, and talk about, at a time where was still everything was segregated, that Hendricks made the pool here available to students that went to the Pine Street School. Because they weren't allowed to students weren't allowed to have any grounds. But Hendricks allowed them to come on campus and use the pool here. And so there's a connection to that community directly with the lyrics. Somewhere along the way. Cutting off the physical access, I guess.
Well, it's kind of weird when you go down there. When you walk out the WAC, you can come down under the tunnel, but there are actually like fences and barricades. Like there's not even a sidewalk to go over there.
There are no crosswalks beyond at the roundabout. It's scary.
Right.
Every time I see someone standing there, I just think, you're okay. But
is it the original high school, right, by Interstate 2?
I don't even know about that. The original Conway High School?
The original, like, segregated block.
Oh, the original African American high school here in Conway was over there. I don't even know. Is it gone now?
Yeah, and it's right by Interstate. And you remember, like, going karate in that neighborhood, Trey,
Right.
Right by the Interstate.
Yep. No, I think that if, like I said, I haven't gotten around to doing it for Conway yet, but I think you could see there are definitely some patterns where, one of the things that I only learned recently is Hendricks is on the wrong side of the tracks.
You're right.
But I'm sure that there are patterns here as well. I mean, like you said, this area has this racial history as well.
The do not recall what the name of the group that consulting group and research group that did the background for the MLK. But they found some interesting information about as you go down Markham and intersect with Oak, but there was a whole section of that originally historically were black businesses, and a large black church was right there on Oak Street in that area, and then the black business district came all the way up. And so they had such good information, and I think that most of it is accessible through the little Pine Street Museum. Stuff that I've never heard of. All sorts of things you didn't know. And I've lived here my whole life, so that was really neat.
Yeah, to me, that's one of the key issues is that so many of us go through life not knowing this because it's just not part of our education. It's just, it just kind of gets glossed over. And, I think that's one of my goals is to make people aware.
There's a lot in one of your slides. And it said like Hendrix and the in space. Yeah, there's
Yeah, they put a little special plaque up there. Whoops.
yeah, did you get funding from?
I think the zoo did that.
Oh, okay.
Say that.
Like the
Oh, well. Oh, you know what? The Arkansas Space Grant Consortium, that Dr. Hatch got a grant for that. She got a grant to buy those little purple air monitors. That's what that's.
oh, that's cool.
Yeah, she bought. One of the things we did is we sent all of our participants home with those purple air monitors so that they could go to their neighborhood and do it.
How many monitors are there? How many were they able to?
Well, you know what? I'm gonna just show you if I can. Can I escape from this? Escape. I'm gonna show you. Website. So the data from those air monitors actually gets uploaded. You have to have electricity and you have to have Wi-Fi. So the data from those purple air monitors gets uploaded to this national database. And so you can see we have a couple here in Conway. Here's one that I think that was actually on campus here somewhere. That one's down at Dr. Hatch's house. That one's. Oh, I probably kicked it or something. I'm sorry.
Maybe just. Just.
Well, since there's only 4 of us here, I can just show you my monitor. How big that is. But so this is this map that's online, and you can zoom out a little bit and you can see. Whoops, here's some of the ones. So we've established one down there. We had one at the zoo there that I think is maybe broken, but we've established a couple of them around here and we're trying to get more. But if you zoom out here and look at sort of the national scale. You can see that these things are all over the country, and you can really see if you pay attention to this. Take a second for it to look. You can see that the red and purple are the real hot spots where you got problems, and at different times of the year you can really see areas of Southern California will have problems. When we had all those wildfires, this whole area up here was just solid red. There you go. See some of the Bay Area, Los Angeles, New York, and that kind of thing. So they're getting pretty good coverage. And the nice thing about this is, we're collecting national level data, at a much finer resolution than the EPA is doing it. Now, our instruments are not as good as the EPA's, but we have a lot better coverage.
How do you access, if just a layperson wanted to take a look,
Yeah, just if you Google purple air.
okay.
Yeah. And you can buy one of those things if you're interested in what the air quality is like around your area. You know, I have one outside my house, and I have been pretty surprised at how sensitive it is. You know, like when somebody pulls up in the driveway, you can see it's fine. Someone, you know, or someone's, you know, burning trash down the street or something like that.
That's nice.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming out. I know that, you know, quite a bit. This was got a little bit sidetracked by the weather, but I think it's,
We can-